Welcome back to Beattie and Reith. Stephen Münchenberg is with us now from the Australian Bankers Association. Stephen, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Peter.
Stephen, as you know, the banking industry is getting kicked around politically, and you're the latest political football. So we wanted to talk to you about a number of issues, serious economic ones, but before we do that, how do you respond to the way the banking industry is being perceived? What do you say to ordinary Australians? If you could actually say to ordinary mums and dads, this is what the banking industry means to you, this is why you need to support it, what would you say?
Well, look, first of all, Peter, I would acknowledge that there have been some issues in the industry. So we've acknowledged that, we are working to fix those. But look, beyond that, we actually have a very fine banking system. We have one of the strongest banking systems in the world, and that is incredibly important in uncertain economic times, particularly globally. We've got very high customer satisfaction. Most people actually think their own bank is fine. It's sort of banks generally they have an issue with. And we actually have a very innovative banking system that's providing a lot of convenience, ease of banking, and quite cheap banking. We're the only industry that I know of that actually provides services, bank accounts free of charge. So there's a lot of positives about the banking industry, but yes, we understand that the politics of where we are as well.
So you pay a lot of taxes, you pay a lot of contributions to the country. What do you pay? What does the banking industry pay to Australia?
Well, look, we're the largest corporate taxpayers. We pay close to the full 30% of tax. That's, I think, about $13 billion, I think was the last figure. So substantial contributors there. And of course, we also, people talk a lot about the profits, and there seems to be an assumption that somehow banks hang on to this money. But three-quarters of that is actually sent back to Australians. A lot of Australians own shares directly, and of course all of our superannuation funds hold large numbers of bank shares. So there's a whole host of ways in which we're contributing back into the community, back into the economy.
Yes, Stephen, thanks again for coming. How many Australians really would be immediately affected or informally, as it were, through superannuation? Are we talking about 1 million or 5 million or whatever of Australians who actually have shares directly or indirectly?
Well, look, in terms of superannuation, it's virtually all of us. So all of us who have got superannuation, I'm almost certain even the self-managed funds will typically have bank shares. They're blue chip shares, so typically have those. But look, a lot of Australians hold shares directly. It's hard to count them because they tend to double up between banks. But CBA, for example, last week said they've got 800,000 Australian households who own shares directly. Another bank has told me about 45% of their shareholders are ordinary Australians with less than $10,000 worth of bank shares. So this isn't just about offshore investors or big wealthy or institutional investors. The bulk of those profits are actually going straight back into the community.
Yeah, I think it's very important for people to understand that, because it does seem to be a disconnect, doesn't it, between what's actually happening in the lives of many, in your case, what, 800,000, and if you triple it for the other banks, I don't know what the number is, but 2 million or maybe even more.
Well, yeah.
And let's face it, I mean, these are big businesses, but they're big businesses which are, for many Australians, they own a share in it, and it's a very safe place to put their money. I never quite understand this problem that we seem to have with the very strong position taken by the Labor Party and even by some coalition people.
Well, you've got Liberals now that want to set up a tribunal.
Well, honestly, I think they've got their, there's something wrong with their heads, basically, because...
Is this the Liberal Party generally, or is this
well, I don't mind which part of the Liberal Party you want to take. If they got it wrong, they definitely got it wrong. But I suppose the other thing to be said about this is that I haven't understood Labor's position on this, because isn't it the case that only a little while ago the Labor Party were actually opposed to some form of Royal Commission because that was being put up by the Greens? So to me that smells like just populism at its worst, really. And now that they've run a big campaign on it, they're still on it. But I don't understand their thinking, quite frankly. Can you make a comment on it?
Well, I mean, you two probably know a hell of a lot more about politics than I do, but I mean, it's certainly the case that it was the Greens who were originally pushing for a Royal Commission. That seems to have been adopted by the Labor Party earlier this year, but previously they did vote against a Green motion to have a Royal Commission. And look, the Royal Commission is supposedly about trying to find what's wrong with the industry, but where there are problems, we already know what they are. We've had 5 parliamentary inquiries into different aspects of the banks just in this term, well, sorry, in the previous term of the government. We've had about, in fact, over a dozen parliamentary inquiries since the financial crisis. They've received hundreds of submissions from ordinary Australians. So look, we know what the issues are, and that's why earlier in the year we announced a package of improvements across the industry. Those are being overseen by a former Commonwealth Auditor General. We've appointed a former Commonwealth Public Service Commissioner, for example, to look at the way in which bank staff are paid to make sure that we're not creating incentives for staff to put their interests ahead of, or the bank's interests ahead of the customers. So we're tackling these already. A Royal Commission is just another inquiry, certainly a very serious one, but it produces just another report, and we think it's better to actually get on where there are issues and fix them now, and in the meantime get on with supporting the economy.
Stephen, let me ask you this question, because the reality is the political debate has moved in a certain direction, and there's a lot of ordinary Australians, rightly or wrongly, who are being influenced by that debate, who, if you look at polls, do support a Royal Commission or support what the Prime Minister's doing about the CEOs having to appear before various parliamentary committees. We see you regularly articulating on behalf of the banking industry, and I understand that, and that's your job. But what does the industry itself have to do? Should we have the CEOs out there explaining, for example, when they don't pass on a full interest rate, but in fact increase the dividend return for seniors, for example? I mean, when we advertised the show, a whole lot of seniors sent me emails saying, hang on, I'm better off now that one of the banks, a couple of the banks actually put up the interest rate. So there's a conflict between what they do. But my central question, Stephen, is this. Should the banking industry engage with Australians a lot more in terms of communicating their message?
Well, Peter, I think clearly we need to, because the message is not getting through. I mean, the Royal Commission's popular because I think for most people at a fairly superficial level it's, would you like to give the big banks a whack? Yeah, sure, why not? Without necessarily working through what the consequences of that might be. We've clearly, we make decisions that affect ordinary Australians, so I think we should be accountable, and the bank CEOs accept that. They heard the Prime Minister's call with the recent interest rate decisions, and they've come out with much more detailed explanations. I think we need to learn from that. But you do also raise an interesting point. I mean, I understand why mortgage interest rate decisions are so important to the third of Australian households that have a mortgage. But equally, mortgage holders are enjoying the lowest interest rates in more than half a century at the moment. There's a lot of people out there, self-funded retirees, people who've got some savings in a deposit account, who rely on bank dividends, but particularly on the interest side, who are really being squeezed by these low interest rates. And you don't often hear about that side of the equation. I'm not quite sure why politicians don't talk up more for those Australians who have worked hard all their lives and are now trying to live off their savings.
Well, I think that's a very powerful point to be made, and I think the politicians have been just falling into a standard old Royal Commission type approach which we've seen. But isn't it also true though that for the Labor Party there's a long history about the banks? I mean, Bob Menzies had to deal with this. I mean, is it more than just an issue of the day, but in fact I think you could go so far as to say it's a cultural approach that the Labor Party has to these issues, because it's really part of their DNA, isn't it? And it's going to be hard to get them out of it, I think.
Well, certainly a former Labor Party Prime Minister reminded me that the ABA was established to fight Ben Chifley's attempt to nationalise the banks back in the 1940s, so I suppose in that sense I should be thankful. But look, Peter, bashing the banks is a long-standing Australian tradition. I mean, I've read stuff going back to the 1860s where people have been writing about what terrible things the banks are. So look, that's not a reason for us not to try and work on the issues, but I think we have to accept that at the end of the day, a lot of people aren't happy about handing over money to their bank, and we have to sort of accept that. So,
Stephen, the thing I find, and unfortunately time's running out, but one last thing I wanted to put to you, one of the things I find interesting is that the banks have never really argued the importance of the stability to the Australian economy enough. I mean, we have 4 big banks, and we've got smaller banks like Suncorp and others, the regional banks, Bendigo Bank, that do a good job. It's a very ugly competitive economy out there. The banks give us a degree of stability. I never understand why they don't argue that or put that case to Australians a lot more.
Yeah, well, Peter, we try. I mean, we have one of the safest and strongest, most resilient banking systems in the world. we say that. For whatever reason, it's the bad news stories that get printed, not necessarily the stories about the strength. Or if they do get printed, they tend to be in the back end of the paper and the more technical businessy parts. So,
you're right.
We certainly don't want to risk that. I mean, neither side of politics should be doing anything that risks confidence in the stability of our banking system.
We agree. Well, Stephen, good luck, and
Good
thank you for being with us.